Since it's no longer October, I think this calls for a celebration. Oh, no, I'm gonna give you guys epilepsy. Hang on. I just meant like a celebration as in a different color behind me. Not that we're at the club with strobe lights. My lights had other plans. Anyways. Hi everybody, I'm Amber Rose, the Religious Hippie. You could basically follow me on any social media platform, or you can go straight to my website at thereligioushippie.com. So, now, yes, October's officially over. It's so crazy how fast this year is flying by. We're officially in November, and we've been in November for a little while. I did my whole, Holy Tide type of video thing, so that was a lot of fun. So this is technically like the third video I'm doing in November, but is anyone really keeping track? Today's video is not one that came highly requested, but one that I feel as though is really important, and that is about spiritual directors. Over the last couple months, I have specifically been getting a lot of emails regarding spiritual directors, if I would be somebody's spiritual director, if they know how they can find a spiritual director, all of that stuff. And so because of I wouldn't say the demand for a video, but the demand that people are asking me, I figured I'd just make a video out of it. So that's what we're doing today. So the first thing I want to address is what a spiritual director is. A spiritual director is a priest, preferably, who is trained in prayer, Catholicism as a whole, and theology. So this priest is basically a coach, mentor, accountability partner, and companion as somebody goes about this path that God has laid before them. Usually that involves their vocation, because let's be honest, it is not easy discerning what our vocation is. So I actually didn't know this, but spiritual directors do have to go to spiritual direction school. I feel like this isn't really talked about all that much, and that's one of the reasons I didn't really know about it until I talked to a priest, and he was like, yeah, you actually have to go to school for this. And I was like, that makes so much more sense than just people assuming that they're meant to be spiritual directors type of thing. So yes, there is schooling, there is training you have to go through in order to be a spiritual director. I've noticed that a lot of spiritual direction programs are partnered with big universities like Franciscan, for example, out in Steubenville, but schooling is necessary because not everybody is called to be a spiritual director. And in fact, I don't think lay people should be spiritual directors at all. My emotions! Now, I'm sure there are people out there who give great spiritual advice, great life advice, and just advice as a whole. I'm sure there are lay people out there who have lived a very holy life and do have advice that they could give somebody, but that does not mean a lay person is cut out to be a spiritual director or that a lay person should be a spiritual director. I cannot stress how much spiritual responsibility is put on somebody as a spiritual director. You are culpable spiritually for this other person that you are spiritually leading. Being a spiritual director is more about the grace than about the knowledge of the topic. You could have an extensive knowledge about all of these different topics and how to help someone. You might have even lived the exact life almost of this person, but without God's grace, it doesn't matter. I've talked to quite a few priests about this, and almost every single one of them has discouraged lay person spiritual direction. And it's simply because those people do not have a grasp on the spiritual culpability and the spiritual responsibility of being a spiritual director. And many of them do not have the proper graces or disposition of heart to be a spiritual director. Many of them, it seems, want to be a spiritual director out of their own gain or some sort of deep-rooted pride where they believe that they could be the reason this person finds God. It's very interesting when I talk to them about this because I never really viewed it from that point or that perspective, but when they met with a bunch of lay spiritual directors, the number one thing that each of them pointed out to me was that each one struggled with pride. But these priests did suggest that lay people could be, advisors, life advisors, give advice, go out with a friend. You don't need the title of spiritual director, and in fact, you shouldn't, because that's a lot of responsibility, like we've already stated twice. You can still give that advice without needing to be a spiritual director. My husband, when he was in school, he was assigned a spiritual director. And I believe this was before he converted to Catholicism he was at least in the process of it, but I don't think he was Catholic just yet. And basically he was assigned this she was Catholic, spiritual director to help him as he was going through life and whatever. Basically, every student was assigned a spiritual director. Well, this spiritual director lady attended pride parades. She had a very warped sense of who God was and mercy and all of that stuff. She didn't even have a good foundation of Catholic teaching. My husband recognized that and was like, this is extremely dangerous. Not just for the spiritual direction lady, but also for the people that she's giving spiritual direction to. So that's just one of the dangers of lay people being spiritual directors. I even had an experience when I was first coming back into my faith where I was meeting with a spiritual director that was assigned to me by this other woman I knew, and she was like, oh, you guys would be a great fit. You guys have a lot of stuff in common. And I was like, okay, sure. At that time, I had no idea what the purpose of a spiritual director was. I just thought it was like someone you hung out with, they gave you some advice, and that was it. I already did that with most of my other friends, so I was like, well, what's the difference between that and just meeting with someone who's like holier than I was? So I went out with this lady probably about 3 times, and every single time I knew way more than she did. And that's not to be, oh, I knew more than she did. Basic theology, guys. Basic theology on confession, the mass, all of this stuff. It was like I was being her spiritual director. And after 3 times of meeting with her, she actually told me specifically, she was like, I'm supposed to be your spiritual director. You're not meant to be mine. And I was like, well, maybe you need one. That's kind of besides the point. The point is that there is a danger in lay people who are poorly catechized, who go into it for their own self-gratification and not for God, not because God gave them a charism for it, not because God calls them to it, but because for their own self-fulfillment. And it's bad. It's really bad. The outcomes are not good. I personally believe that priests are the best spiritual directors because you can go to confession with them during spiritual direction, literally killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You can get items blessed with them. You already know that they are versed in theology and Catholicism and philosophy and all of these things that you need and that you need in your prayer life that you are not educated on because they literally went to seminary for all of this. So in my opinion, lay people have no business being spiritual directors, and I know that's a hot take. People are going to be up in arms in the comments saying, well, I have a lay person spiritual director and she's great. I'm glad that you found a spiritual director who's a lay person who doesn't say heretical things and knows Catholicism or theology at least, but a lay person cannot compete with a priest spiritual director. So then I get the question, well, how do I know I need a spiritual director, or do I not need a spiritual director? Does everyone need a spiritual director? What's going on there? And the answer is no, not everybody needs a spiritual director. In fact, most people don't. And a lot of people will differ on who needs a spiritual director and why. Some people say you only need a spiritual director for small little inconveniences in your life, or if you just converted to the faith. Other people will say, oh, you need a spiritual director for all of those really, really difficult times of desolation and dry prayer and all of that. Other people will say, oh, you need spiritual direction for everything going on in your life because every part of your life involves God and you need to have guidance on all of it. So when it really comes down to figuring out if you specifically need a spiritual director, it boils down to this. If you are growing by yourself in your interior life, and by interior life, I mean your prayer life, your meditation life, you're growing in relationship with God, you're going to mass, you're receiving the sacraments, all of these things, and you want more, and you want to follow God's will for your life, and you're looking for your vocation, all of those things, I would say yes, that would require a spiritual director. But I cannot stress this enough. Spiritual direction and your spiritual director is not a therapist. It is not therapy, and it's not really even hangout time. Yes, you are spending time with this amazing holy person, and that's fantastic, and you can of course enjoy it, but it's not a time to be like, oh yeah, my Aunt Kathy, she bought 3 cats the other day. No. Spiritual direction is meant to help you grow in discipleship that you have already established on your own. A spiritual director is meant to help you discern your vocation because that is one of the most important things. And if you are already with a spiritual director who has discerned their vocation and they're in the priesthood, they're in the nunnery, they're in the sisterhood, whatever, then they can help you understand your vocation. And most people are called to marriage. It's a very select few who are actually called to religious life because it takes a very special person, but these people can help you to discern if you are meant for religious life or if you're meant for married life. and they can kind of bring things up to you in your prayer life and stuff that you can work on so that you can discern better. Another reason to get spiritual direction is if you have an apostolate or a ministry like I do. So I have a spiritual director because of my ministry, because I am culpable for all of you guys spiritually in one way or another, and I need to make sure that I stay on track so I don't lead everybody else who's following my ministry astray. There is a lot of spiritual responsibility and accountability that comes with running this ministry, and so I need to make sure that you guys are being taken care of, and I need to do that by taking care of myself spiritually through my spiritual director, making sure I am on track, making sure that what I'm saying is true, and making sure that the ministry doesn't come between me and my vocation, which is, obviously my marriage. And so it's really important for me to have a spiritual director, so I'm not leading people astray, I'm not letting it come between my vocation, and making sure that I'm still doing it for God and I'm not doing it for my own glorification. So those are basically two situations where I would highly suggest you get a spiritual director. If you've made it this far into the video, comment coffee.
Does anybody want coffee?
Coffee's good. But like I said, not everybody needs a spiritual director. Some people might just need something like SOCA, which is Souls of the Christian Apostolate. This is a phenomenal ministry and program. Highly suggest you check it out. I am linking their website below in the description so you can learn more about them. But my friend Kevin Rotary, he basically started this whole ministry, and I actually spoke at SOCA. That was one of my first talks ever in 2022. I went to Colorado and I spoke at SOCA, and I met Bishop Strickland, and I just met a bunch of wonderful people. Some I'm still friends with actually till this day, and they're just the sweetest people ever. But basically, SOCA has this really cool program, and it's a new approach to the interior life of discipleship. So they offer a structured spiritual formation program, which guides participants step by step through traditional stages of the spiritual life with practical steps. So each person is paired with a personal outreach coordinator for one-on-one support with integrating mental prayer into your daily life, helping you overcome those obstacles, and then discovering a unique path to spiritual growth that works for you, your vocation, etc. And then in addition, which this is honestly my favorite part, and I'm working with Daniel, who is part of SOCA, and we're reading a book together, and we're talking about interior life and mental prayer and all of that stuff. And it's been super fruitful for me personally, and I think it'll be fruitful for you. They foster this communal accountability with regular group meetings and, peer check-ins. So basically, they've created a very supportive community that encourages perseverance and growth in prayer. And I cannot stress to you how important this is and what a treasure this is. So if you can, I would highly suggest signing up and getting in touch with them, because this is truly what I believe most people need. You don't need a spiritual director, you need something like SOCA. And this was not sponsored. They did not ask me to do a shout out or anything. Kevin's just a good friend of mine, and I was just on their podcast recently, but I don't think it's coming out until December. So I'll let you guys know when that's happening. But I have always supported this ministry because I think it's so important, and there's never been anything like this that I have seen, and it's unique, it's important, and I think everybody could benefit from this, so definitely go check them out. Again, linking that below. Another thing you might need instead of spiritual direction is a confessor. I think everybody should have a confessor, personally. So a confessor is a priest that you go to confession with exclusively. You don't go to different parishes for different times, you don't go to a different priest that's in your parish or whatever. You go to one priest, he gets to know you, you get to know him, either through face-to-face confession or through the screen confession. You just tell him like, hey, it's me again. And basically these meetings can be scheduled, or you can, meet with them if it's, scheduled confession at your church, whatever works. But again, your priest will basically get to know you, will get to know your soul, get to know what you struggle with, what your vices are, what you're strong in, what you excel in, all of those really, really important things, and can make tailor-made advice just for you, or give you specific penances that will help with the specific issues that you struggle with. I think this is probably one of the most easiest ways and most profound ways to grow in the interior life, is when we recognize our flaws, we look inward, we see, how can I be better? How can I grow in holiness? How can I do these things? We're confessing those specific sins that we struggle with so much, and we have a priest who understands and is able to give us specific advice to us. Like that you don't need a spiritual director if you have a confessor, in my opinion, unless again, you're a religious or something like that. Like if you have a confessor, you've hit the jackpot. Basically though, I cannot stress how important having a confessor is. So honestly, a confessor or a ministry like SOCA might be what you need as opposed to spiritual direction. You can also just ask to talk to a priest. You can just ask him for advice, whether it's in the confessional and I know people are going to get upset about that, like the lines are already too long, if you have a specific question, call or like text them or what. You know what? Sometimes if the situation persists, then whatever, just ask the question. But not every person and not every situation calls for a spiritual director. And honestly, I kind of feel like recently, I don't know if it's been recently, I don't know, but I feel like people have been wanting a spiritual director because it's been more of a trend than in the past. Like recently, at least that's what I've discovered. And obviously that's not very healthy either. Anyways, let's say you heard my rant up until now, my little TED talk, if you will, and you decided, yeah, I still need a spiritual director. Great, awesome, welcome to the club. How do you get one? It seems like it's almost impossible to find a spiritual director these days. Our priests are understaffed severely sometimes in certain orders, so there aren't enough priests to be spiritual directors for everyone who needs one. Well, here's some things you can do. Number one, you can go to your parish. This is probably the easiest thing you can do. And you can go to your parish priest and just ask him if he's open to being your spiritual director. And then you guys can go out for coffee and not be like officially in a spiritual direction session, but basically just getting to know each other and figuring out if it is right a fit. And if not, that's totally fine. Just be like, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. But if he isn't available, if he can't be your spiritual director, ask him if he knows of anyone who would be a good fit for you, or if he knows of anyone who is a spiritual director who is willing to do spiritual direction. If for some reason that doesn't work, you can check out the other Catholic churches in your area, maybe go to confession with them a couple times and get a feel for how they do confession and for what kind of advice they give, etc., to see if they'd be a good fit. You can't just walk into a church and walk up to a priest right after Mass and be like, will you be my spiritual director, without them knowing like anything about you. So it's really good to kind of have a little rapport with the priest first before asking them to be your spiritual director. The third thing I would suggest is a lot of dioceses have lists of spiritual directors that could be a good fit for you. Again, I would only suggest you look for priest spiritual directors, and some dioceses will probably have lay people listed, but most dioceses do have a list of spiritual directors that would be available for that. A while ago, I was watching a video that Father Columba did on spiritual direction. I think it's called like Spiritual Direction 101 or something like that. And he basically said you can feel a priest out during confession to see whether or not they would be a good fit. You can ask them a question about your interior life, your spiritual life, and be like, Father, what do you think about this? What does this mean? And see if his response is something that actually hits home with you and you understand and you're like, oh yeah, that's totally it. Like that's the advice I needed. He might be a good fit for your spiritual director. But if not, it's confession. He gives you absolution. You never have to talk to him again. Although you should go back to confession, especially if he's the only priest there. But the point is that you don't have to be a spiritual directee for that if that's not what you want. And the last thing I would say is maybe call some convents or nunneries and ask if there are any sisters or nuns who are, open to doing spiritual direction. The next question I get is how often should I go to spiritual direction? And I only go once a month, sometimes once every 3 months personally, because sometimes his advice rings so true that I don't have to go back because I just kind of reiterate his advice over and over again. And I'm like, yeah, this is great. I don't need to talk about it because we already talked about it, still rings true, whatever. But when I first did spiritual direction, I went probably twice a month so that we got more acquainted with each other on a personal level. He got to know my life. I got to know, the way that he gives advice, and we got more comfortable with each other, which was very, very helpful. And then after that, once we were established with spiritual direction, it was once a month or once every 3 months. But if you have a good spiritual director, you don't have to go to spiritual direction more than once a month. And then the last question I get is, what if I have absolutely no option to have a spiritual director? There's just none, nada, nowhere in sight. They just don't exist where I am. If you can't find a spiritual director, or they're just simply not available in your country or wherever you are, you can still grow in the interior life. I would start with a detailed examination of conscience from the Bulldog Catholic. There's a PDF. If you Google it, great, but otherwise I'll put the PDF in the description below. Keep in mind, it is a PDF, so it is going to open to a PDF or download or whatever. But this is a very, very thorough examination of conscience that I highly suggest everybody do before confession if you're going to confession once a month. But this really helps you kind of narrow in on the vices and the sins that you truly struggle with and where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are. And then you can basically, after doing the Bulldog Catholic one and really recognizing that, go to confession, confess everything. Confess the vices, the venial sins, the mortal sins, temptations, whatever it might be, and start with a clean slate. And then once you've done that, you can do a daily examination of conscience, which is not as thorough as the Bulldog Catholic. That's just one to get you kind of started to understand where you're lacking, where you're good, all of that stuff. But then you can do a shorter version of the examination of conscience and look back on your day, reflect on yourself, and be like, okay, I did really well in this area in patience, but I didn't have as much humility as I should have, or something. And then the next day you work on those virtues. That is how you gain momentum in the interior life, is by uniting yourself with Christ and to reflect and to make yourself more Christ-like. Also, meditation, that's another way we can be more Christ-like, is through putting ourselves in situations in the Bible, physically putting ourselves there, experiencing all of these things that have happened and focusing on Christ's life, because we become more like Christ the more we get to know about Christ and the more we experience him. Also, pray the rosary, pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet, go to daily mass. You don't have to do all 3 of those every single day, but it is really good to do those 3 things every week. If you go to adoration, if you go to daily mass, if you pray the rosary every day, you should be praying the rosary every day, but I get it. Praying the Divine Mercy Chaplet, all of those things we should be doing weekly. The rosary should be daily, but I get it. Things are hard. You could pray it in the car. You can pray it while you're walking. You can pray it while you're working out. There are 1,000,001 ways to pray the rosary, so that should be done daily. If you don't have time to go to daily mass every single day, try to make it at least once a week extra. We're actually going to mass tonight because it's Wednesday night mass. And usually they have adoration afterwards, which is just amazing. Make sure that you're receiving the sacraments regularly, going to confession once every 2 weeks and no less than once a month. Make sure you're receiving the Eucharist in a state of grace. All of these things will help you make leaps and bounds in your interior life. So you do not need a spiritual director to grow in virtue, to grow in the interior life, although they are helpful. You just need to persevere and be open to what God's will is for you, whatever that might be. All right, guys, that is it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I would love to know your thoughts below. Please be respectful, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Bye.